Good evening, everyone. The Center for Civil Society welcomes you all to this spontaneous dialogue, a discussion series which aims to bring together thinkers and policy experts to discuss key issues of contemporary importance and engage in quality debate. Today's topic is the highly contested and hotly debated issue of the recently passed farm laws and their impact on agriculture in India. And for today's dialogue, we have with us Dr. Parth Shah, who is the president of the Center for Civil Society and founder of Indian School of Public Policy, and Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan, who is the founder of Lok Satta Party and the founder of Foundation for Democratic Reforms. Dr. Narayan is a physician by training who went into the Indian Administrative Service. He's had 16 years of distinguished public service in various capacities, after which he resigned in 1996 and worked with like-minded colleagues for formation of the Lok Satta Party. Dr. Narayan has been actively pursuing reforms in education, healthcare, local government empowerment, and various anti-corruption measures. So thank you, Dr. Parth and Dr. Narayan, for joining us today. And before we begin, just to inform everyone, we will be taking questions towards the end of the session. So please put your questions in the comment section and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. So without any further ado, please let's welcome Dr. Parth and Dr. Narayan.
Thank you, Swati. And thank you for having us for this spontaneous order dialogue. I think some of you know that the phrase the spontaneous order has been popularized by Friedrich Hayek and particularly the Austrian School of Economics. And it's a very powerful idea. And that's the blog of CCS, which is called Spontaneous Order. So I'm very pleased to have Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan to join us for this conversation on the agriculture bills. Many have described these bills as the equivalent of 1991 economic reforms. So this is a 1991 moment for agriculture in India. Now, as I think about this issue, let me give a slightly broader context. And maybe we can also start our conversation for the larger reforms and then slowly come down to what is being happening in the agriculture sector. And I think when the key point of this sort of discussion or debate still remains after 91 reforms, that have the rich gotten richer and poor have not benefited much, right? And that's the sort of standard storyline that you hear about most of the reforms. And I'm sure the similar lines are coming up as you see in the commentary on the current bills. That's the corporates and the rich people are going to benefit more and the poor farmers are going to lose. Now I want to sort of put this in the context of the debate around the 91 reforms. And a lot of people argued that as a result of 91 reforms, the India benefited, but the Bharat lost, right? It was seen as an urban versus rural divide. And 91 reforms helped the urban people, but did not really work well for the rural people. Of course, as we got more data in the late 90s, early 2000, we also realized that some of the gains which have happened in the rural areas, the consumption engine that rural areas have been driving, have been quite powerful. And they contributed as much to the later phases of the growth as the urban areas. So it's not so much about India versus Bharat in this debate. One way to think about it, this is what we have been talking about at CCS. I would sort of get your first thought on this. The way we have been thinking about at CCS is to think about liberalization and which sectors have been liberalized and which sectors have not been liberalized. And we did quite a bit of research that the sectors which have been liberalized, like aviation, banking, right, call centers, BPO, which was a big growth story in the 90s, right? Those are the sectors which did well. And the people who worked in those sectors, right, have also done quite well. Actually, media is also one good example of that. Media has done extremely well in the 90s and early 2000s. The sectors which we did not see much liberalization are the ones that did not do so well, right? And one key sector that did not see much of liberalization at all until now, in a sense, in 2020, right, is agriculture. So I want to sort of see what are your thoughts on the overall reform story of India? When you look back on 91 reforms and see what debates we had, what has happened because of it, how would you think broadly about that India story of reforms?
I think it's a great question, because now it's almost 3 decades, 29 years. I think we must reflect very honestly and figure out what exactly has happened, what has not happened. I often think that 91 reform was a pretty easy part, not to underestimate the importance of what has been accomplished. Now, to give an imagery, the productive potential of the nation was cruelly and artificially held back by creating a dam. If you think of productive potential as a stream flowing, deliberately the Indian state, by a very restrictive license permit quota Raj, has created a big dam, and therefore this whole pent-up potential is simply that. Now, what Dr. Manmohan Singh, under Mr. Narasimha Rao's leadership, out of compulsion, it was not really out of conviction, but compulsion. But the nice thing about them is they did it sincerely. They did not do a few things to overcome the temporary difficulty, though they limited their reform to a few areas, select areas. In those select areas, they tried to go to the logical conclusion. What they did is they simply opened this dam, this sluice gates. Therefore, there is a flow. Now, as long as the pent-up potential has flown down, the level has gone up in the river. That is the economic growth we have seen and the benefits that have flowed. But once the reservoir is empty, no matter how many times you breach the dam, it doesn't really help. You have to create the potential for wealth creation. That is the catchment treatment in the irrigation or water management parlance. That is governance, education, healthcare, infrastructure. So if there is failure, obviously there is failure. It's inadequate. Nobody says whatever happened was enough. It was necessary but not sufficient. So one, as you said rightly, the reform was limited only to industrial sector, essentially. Services sector, thank God, there was no serious restraint even before that. And as you said rightly, the computer-based services, etc., because the government really didn't play a role, people figured out a way of doing something or the other with all the constraints that we have in the country. So essentially, the reform was limited to industrial manufacturing sector, to some extent financial sector. Otherwise, the vast unorganized sector of the country and agriculture, 92% of the workers in India are unorganized, eking out a precarious livelihood, and agriculture. They were either still constrained by the old framework of license permit quota Raj, and that's what Essential Commodities Act, that's what 100 other restrictions are, or by the labor laws. The unorganized sector is the biggest sufferer on account of the excessive and irrational protection to the organized sector, irrespective of productivity. We have to give the workers and the unions the freedom. It's a constitutional freedom, Article 19(1)(c). But if the freedom becomes restrictive of economic growth and restrictive of entry into the job market and denies 92% of Indians a decent life and a decent wage and opportunity, then I think we have a serious problem. So it's on account of these two primarily, not addressing the unorganized sector's problems by addressing labor laws and other restrictive practices, and not looking at agriculture on which 50% of people of India still depend. That is the economic issue. But otherwise, in a modern economy, how will people gain employment? How will they have the earning capacity? With quality education and quality healthcare. And our education and healthcare are about the most abysmal in the larger economies in the world. Absolutely at the rank bottom. Now, how can you have productivity and incomes going to the ordinary poor without education and health? Otherwise, wealth begets wealth. Wealth gives education, wealth gives capital, wealth gives some assets, therefore you can live off interest. Wealth gives all kinds of advantages. When I don't have wealth by birth, the wealth has to be created by my mind. Mind is sharpened only by education and skills. Without doing that and without giving healthcare and therefore productivity, how can the poor prosper? Now, instead of the government doing what it ought to do, the notion that economic reform creates inequalities is absurd. It is a governance and rule of law. Ultimately, merely because constitutional rights are there is no genuine rule of law to protect the liberties of ordinary people. You're working on hawkers, other people. I mean, these are people, they're trying to lead a life of dignity without seeking anything from the government or the society. They're providing a valuable service. The kind of restrictions we impose on their lives, the kind of mammals we collect, the kind of indifference that we exhibit, and the kind of insecurity under which they live, how can they prosper? At best, they live a subsistence living. So it is a governance failure. We're palming it off on economic policy. I'm not denying the importance of looking at equity issues. I'm not at all underestimating that. But there are also larger questions beyond a nation's ability to handle. I think I'll just make this the last point on this subject. And you understand this better than many of us. I think in the last 25, 30 years, you see a trend where the old corporates, they are losing out in relative terms. If you take the 10 largest companies in the world, I think almost all of them or 9 of them are new companies. They were unknown or they were not there 30 years ago. Technology is now concentrating wealth, whether it is Apple or Microsoft or Google or Alibaba or something else. Technology by a variety of means, on the one hand, is creating consumer satisfaction and giving us better life. Without the technology, you and I would not be conversing in the face of COVID without traveling. So if we say no to that, we are being stupid. At the same time, it seems to have a concentration effect. I think the whole global community must figure out how to deal with that. That's a larger question. But it is not right to say that the poor are not benefited. I think the poor have benefited immensely. Otherwise, there would not be 1 billion mobile telephones in the country. Of which about maybe 25, 30% are smartphones. To say that the poor are not benefiting is absurd. Yes, probably a few people who have better access to technology and skills and organization, they are benefiting more. It's not true to say that the poor are not benefiting. Now, whether equality or equity can be brought on that, I do not know. That's for the future. We have to figure out what to do. But I completely reject the hypothesis that the poor are becoming poorer and richer becoming richer. Absolutely untrue. The poor are becoming better off. The rich probably are even a greater advantage if they are smart enough and if they know how to leverage the modern technology and the growing opportunities. But it's not true to say that technology or economic reform is actually hurting the poor. I'm using mild expressions. It's absolutely untrue.
The rich are also hurting, right? Many of the old industrial houses.
Absolutely. All the big corporates are dead.
They disappeared from the scene.
Absolutely. The fellows who started their enterprises in garages at our age, we are roughly the same age group, they have become the ziga billionaires today, whereas all the big ones today are nowhere. So it's not true. It's actually enterprise and innovation and new technology.
So we had identified 3 groups which have sort of lost out in this economic reforms or liberalization, right? And the one, of course, was agriculture or farmers. Second one was urban informal sector, street vendors and micro enterprises that you see in all our cities and towns of India, right? And the third was the forest dependent communities, tribals. So 3 groups we thought have been pretty much outside the range of reforms that India undertook in 1991, even after 91 also. Now, in 2014, the Street Vendor Act got passed. And so it was sort of one way to help formalize the sector, give them more of a legal status, right? So what the act did is to put the burden on the government to prove the vendor is actually a public nuisance. And only then they can remove the vendor from the public space, unlike what it was before, right? And then in 2018, we saw this amendment to the Indian Forest Act, which made bamboo reclassified from tree to a grass. That has opened tremendous opportunities for tribals living in these areas for their livelihood, and as well as obviously huge environmental benefit in terms of not having to cut timber, where we can use bamboo for most of those places. Right? So I think 2014 saw the street vendor reform. 2018 saw the sort of tribal or forest dwelling communities sort of benefit amendment to the Indian Forest Act. And the 2020, now we are seeing the agriculture reforms. So somehow it looks like after about 25 years or so, slowly the other part of the India is catching up and getting to participate in this larger growth story.
You're absolutely right. It could have been faster. It could have been more holistic. We are doing very slowly and in bits and pieces. But the fact that something is happening, we should welcome it and we should encourage them to do more instead of creating a problem when something right is done. One of the criticisms that is necessary but not sufficient, therefore I oppose, I think it's a very dangerous criticism. The only response in a large and complex polity like ours is It's necessary. We're glad you're doing it. Welcome. But some more needs to be done. Please do it. I think that should be the approach in all these respects. I don't think that you and I can claim that all the unorganized sector, urban poor, all the problems are solved. Some beginning is made. I don't think that the tribal communities and the far-flung communities in the most remote areas of India, their challenges are addressed fully. But again, some small beginning here and there. Similarly, agriculture, these three laws, I don't think they really address all the challenges of agriculture, but certainly to the extent that the shackles of the government, state-imposed shackles are removed, and therefore to the extent that free market operates and the demand picks up and the price will be a little better to the advantage of the farmer, they are welcome and necessary, but a lot more needs to be done.
Let me ask you this question. I know you worked in the government for quite some time. You are one of the elite officers of the government of India, and you left the service and became part of civil society. How did you come to realize these ideas, come to believe in these ideas, giving more freedom to people, giving more opportunity to people in a better way to solve India's problems than smart people sitting in Delhi trying to figure out how to solve these problems?
I think it's a great question. There are two strands in this, in my thinking at least. The first is public versus private sector, economic freedom, so on and so forth. The second is the people's empowerment and they have the capacity to do things. The second one, I think I always intuitively had that right from childhood because I grew up in a village. In a remote village, I studied in a village school, Telugu medium, the government school, the Panchayat Samiti and Zilla Parishad, so on and so forth. But despite all the deprivation, despite all the disadvantages, hundreds of thousands of my generation got fantastic education with very little amenities, with very little resources, because the society cared, there was accountability, and the natural talent could flourish. Largely because the community owned these institutions. They took care, they enforced accountability, and therefore everything went well. The moment governments tried to centralize, take away the role of the community and the local governments, education started collapsing. Similarly, I saw in my village, way back in early 1960s, I'm talking about, in a remote village, a black-topped road, piped water supply, a proper high school building constructed. Until that time, we only had thatched huts, etc. Electricity, if not every home, to most homes. I saw that happening because of, again, enlightened local leadership, the village and community leadership. So for these reasons, and maybe the innate dignity of a villager, I always believed that empowered people can deliver a great deal, and therefore centralization was wrong. The second part, public versus private, I must confess to you, I joined the civil services like many young people of that generation, believing that government was good and noble, private sector was bad and evil. A very black and white kind of a notion. Truly, when I look back, it appears absurd. But those were the times. The whole tenor, the whole debate was government was good, private was bad. Corporate is bad. The word corporate is an abusive word kind of a thing. Then earlier in my career in 1984, I was appointed as special officer of Vizag Steel Plant. It was then India's largest public sector investment of about 8,000 crore rupees. In those days, big money. Today, 8,000 crores seems to be chicken feed. But believe me, in 84, 8,000 crores was a lot of money. Bigger than many state budgets. So that steel plant special officer essentially looked after the coordination and resolving the issues, dealing with the steel plant, land acquisition, rehabilitation, the labor problems, and dealing with the people, and then making the industry run. The actual management and technical part is the managements. But my role is from the state government, I am there to support them and do whatever it takes. Then it struck me. And since then, I probably said this about several thousand times. The public sector in India is the private sector of those in public office. It has nothing to do with the people of the country. Because the word public is there, no. Words, they gloss meanings, gloss over meanings. They distort meanings. And we take the literal meaning of the word and we assume certain things. We impart nobility. Public doesn't mean public at all. It's just a nomenclature. It is entirely the private property of those in public office. It has nothing to do with the people of the country. Therefore, intuitively, I came to the conclusion that it doesn't matter who manufactures, who makes goods. What matters is, what do the people get out of it? If I get it at a low cost and of good quality, whoever gives it, He is actually providing a national service and I am benefiting. So my discovery of market economy and economic freedom is more intuitive and experiential rather than theoretical and textbook-like, because I never studied economics then or now. There's a formal discipline in my life. So that's a discovery entirely because of public service exposure. Only thing is I was genuinely curious to understand rather than be wedded to a certain frame because you are part of the steel frame. I refuse to be part of that. Maybe that's the only thing I can claim credit for. Otherwise, it's the experience that taught me the lessons. And since then, I would love to look back. Since 1984, 85, well before, several years before the actual economic reform, I have been a very outspoken champion of state getting off the people's backs and giving liberty, and state doing its job and doing the governance part well. And even today, I recognize the importance of state, but in things that they ought to do, not in economic activity.
Good to hear that story. I think it's very quite informative in terms of how people come to believe in certain set of ideas and how their thinking evolves. Coming to, I think, the agri-reforms, I think as you have been reading a lot of commentary in the media, I went through quite a few of the commentaries from various people who are opposing these reforms to understand what are their arguments. I have sort of identified 5 arguments. I'm going to sort of play out one by one and see what your response is to that. And I'm sure some of them may also come back in the Q&A from the audience as we proceed. So the first argument, which is most common that I see, is that this is just the thin wedge for government to get rid of its responsibility to take care of farmers, to attend to the needs of the farmers. And they're sort of passing the buck to the private sector, right? And the way they talk about that is by focusing on MSP, that this is the sort of first step in the direction of getting rid of MSP. There would not be any minimum support price for farmers, and farmers would be left to the wolf, in a sense, of the private sector to be devoured. Right? What is your sense of what's going to happen to MSP? Like what's its legal status, and why such a great fear about it?
Parth, first of all, the law has nothing to do with MSP. We all know that. And the government, because of political compulsions, explicitly stated that they will not give up MSP and procurement. Therefore, to use that as an argument to oppose is meaningless. But if you go further, though I hesitate to mention it now, because if you bring in some other issue, it will become much harder to make the case. But we must also look at the whole procurement. Forget MSP or no MSP. The real issue is the per capita consumption of rice and wheat is actually declining in the country. Look at the numbers. At one stage, it was up to 80, 90 grams per capita. Today, it's now at about 70 grams or so. And it's declining. And it's common sense. All of us, we don't eat a large amount of rice. No, in our childhood, we used to see people eating mounds and mounds of rice. From calorie, we're moving to protein, we're moving to minerals, we're moving to fruits, vegetables, milk, meat, eggs, and so on and so forth. That's the way holistic nutrition is. That's the way normal transition is. And yet, the MSP system, which is largely essential and applicable to rice and wheat, is merely encouraging overproduction of these two crops at the cost of the things for which there is a demand and there's a price increase. Anybody can look at the market price vagaries of all these fruits, vegetables, milk, eggs, fish, meat, etc. versus rice and wheat. Therefore, forget MSP, no MSP. If the farmer is going to get more price because there is greater demand for fruits, vegetables, fish and meat and so on and so forth, if our policies actually discourage the farmers from getting the price and discourage the production of the commodities which are more in demand in the country and abroad, I don't think these are particularly smart policies. I absolutely believe, I don't believe in complete market economy in the sense that farmers do require support. World over, farming is a very difficult occupation. Farming always labors under disadvantage, world over. And people world over recognize that's why they try and put some money into farmers' pockets in the most developed countries. So whatever we are spending, about 150,000 crores by last count, if I'm not mistaken, annually on this whole procurement and distribution system, that money must go to the farmers. I have no doubt whatsoever. But perhaps there are better ways of doing it, enhancing the farmers' income enhancing the competitiveness of Indian agriculture, enhancing the overall competitive advantage of the country, and even foreign exchange earnings of the country. I think we must look at that seriously. Otherwise, somehow artificially propping up a price and therefore overproducing commodities which nobody wants in the world and in the country. You know, I don't know how many people are aware, just 3-4 years ago in Punjab, the scheduled banks had to not write off, but they had to restructure 30,000 crore loan to the state for procurement, an MSP, because the stock was not there. The stock simply was 30,000 crores in one state. One stroke, we had to restructure. Ultimately, who are bearing that burden? You and I. It's the depositors of the bank and the other borrowers of the bank. The money is not going to come from the bank chairman's pockets. It's coming from us.
You made a good point that farmers are supported across the world. Every country has some way of providing support to farmers. But in most countries, the support is usually given through income.
Absolutely.
Opposed to through inputs. What is sort of seemed to be the approach India has taken, which is sort of far sort of worse, is subsidizing water, electricity, fertilizer, and then giving some minimum support price for the output. Right? And as opposed to that, I think converting all of that support into an income support would be far better and probably less distortionary to the other environmental degradation that we see because of this subsidy for water and electricity.
I am totally with you. I am totally with you. That's why when Dr. Rajasekhar Reddy for the first time in India went for free power, I pleaded with him, A, it's bad policy. If you still want free power anyway because you're given a commitment and the people gave you a mandate, you can't go back on that. For heaven's sake, have metering and put a ceiling, cap on the number of units of free power. And if they consume more, put a price. If they consume less, give a reward, give a bonus. They thought about it, but they gave up. But unless, as you said rightly, if our support to the farming community is economically and socially ultimately unproductive, it's extremely damaging. Look at free power, for instance, very popular program. Our groundwater in many pockets is depleted, and people are drilling a borewell after borewell in the hope of a free power. And I know many farmers who committed suicide. Many of the suicide cases, if you actually go into detail, it is the capital investment they made for this repeated borewell drilling in their farms in the hope that they will get water and therefore free power benefit. So the paradoxical damage is that some people are so impoverished that they felt helpless. B, the groundwater is depleted and there is no rational use because free power is there, you simply go on drilling. C, because of the free power, along with the irrational policy of the kind of MSP we give for the 2 crops which are not needed in the country, the moment you have water, what happens? You have very little water, and these are water-intensive crops. You go for paddy or wheat. In case of North, I'm sure it's wheat, but in the South, I know it's paddy. And you are actually damaging not only the environment, but everybody else. D, because it's free power, you're not bothered with the efficiency of the motor. Therefore, the manufacturer is producing substandard motors. There's environmental damage and waste of power without commensurate benefit to the farmer. At every level, it is destructive. The damage is not merely the burden on the exchequer. That, of course, is huge. To the ecology, to the water table, to the cropping pattern, to overall economy is very substantial. Therefore, I entirely agree with you. The farmers need and deserve this support, but put it all in one basket and give it as cash support. And I'm glad to note that Telangana started that with what they call Raitu Bandhu. Now, Government of India, in between, I think Orissa and other states have taken up. I think that's the right way. But slowly dismantle this whole thing, put this money in that other basket.
The second criticism, which seems to be very common, is that these reforms may be good in overall sense, but they're not going to change the lives of the farmers because we have seen something similar being done earlier by some of the states in India. Right? Bihar obviously had abolished APMC in 2009. And there are a few other states like Maharashtra, which allows private mandis for quite some time. But we have not seen any dramatic improvement in the lives of the farmers in Bihar or Maharashtra because of these changes. So, thing is, what's the big deal? It's just sort of brouhaha being made by the government to just keep the attention away from the real problem, which is COVID. But that's not going to help the farmers. So do you see this reform actually helping the farmers, or is it going to be largely a surface phenomenon?
There are two fallacies in this argument. Fallacy one is we are good at making legislation sometimes, but it's more a declaration of intent rather than translating into action. India has 3,000 laws at the federal level and 30,000 laws at the state level. Most of them, the implementers or the prosecutors, the enforcers, they themselves are not aware. Only when they want to make life miserable for somebody, they dig out these papers and then figure out what to do. This law also is very similar. I have seen it very in close quarters in the underdeveloped Andhra Pradesh. Therefore, today is Andhra Pradesh and Telangana as a legislator. Among others, I was a member of the Subordinate Legislation Committee, and I was horrified to note that Andhra Pradesh actually amended the APMC Act. Whatever from 2003 onwards, we were talking about the model law, this, that, some states have adopted, but it's only on paper. We did nothing. The bureaucratic impediments and impediments by making irrational rules were so great that there was a tremendous entry barrier. Nobody was entering. We did not allow them to enter. It's a tick mark. We simply had a check box, and therefore, has APMC Act been amended? Yes, amended. My state has done very well. Therefore, I get 5 marks and my state is fantastic. So that kind of very perfunctory approach, we never allowed it to operate. The second fallacy is these are necessary. They obviously give greater demand for the produce. They give freedom to the farmer, the producer to sell. And therefore, to that extent, they can make a better price discovery and price realization. There's greater choice, but these are not sufficient. The crisis of agriculture is very complex. That it is necessary but not sufficient and therefore should not be done. Necessary, not sufficient, perfect. Therefore should not be done is illogical. Do some more. Bring in market chains, compress the market chain. Allow the retail chains to come in so that grading, packaging, transport, storage, processing, and opening up export markets and retailing, all are taken care of by one agency, and farmers get 65% of the end price. And the whole logistical chain will be improved. A lot of investment will flow. The gross capital formation agriculture is standing still for the past 10 years. Even as the economy probably doubled in the last 10 years, the gross capital formation is the same. In fact, private capital formation is declining. Now, unless you bring in that, and that means unless you liberalize further and allow compression of market chain, you cannot realize the value. And create a storage capacity and give pledge loans so that, because after all, the product is stored already and there is security, and let the farmer have the staying power so that the market can be more balanced. The price will be stabilized. We never did it. Only 3% of the stock in India gets any kind of pledge loan. Have more storage capacity, as opposed to 450 million tons of commodities that can be damaged, perishable commodities. Our storage capacity is only about 7-8%, about 3.8 crore or 38 million tons. Most of it is only for aloo or potato. And
Maharashtra did allow, I think, private mandi for quite some time. When we did some research, we found that they required that you do investment of 2 crore rupees in building the mandi. You have a 10 acre of land minimum, right? And so those are the licensing requirements they put along with opening up the private sector. Right? And obviously at that amount of investment required, most people would not see it worthwhile to take gamble, because nobody knows how it's going to play out, right? When private sector does not know opening a mandi is going to be profitable venture or not. And if you have to put up so much resources upfront, there are not going to be many takers of that idea.
And particularly in dealing with the government, every day you have to get his pacha, his signature, you have to get his license or whatever. We know what it means in India.
And this is research that I'm just going to remind Swati, if she can put up the link for the people on the Facebook to the agriculture primer that CC has recently produced, which documents many of these things about what reforms have happened, what have been the impact of those reforms, and actually why impact hasn't been very positive or substantially positive, largely because of the other hurdles that are in terms of the licensing requirements. Even for trading license, you need to have a license. Sometimes licenses given to particular commodities, not for all trading. Right? So all of those challenges are still inherent in the agri market. So Swati, please do put up the link to the primer. I think that's a great document that will be very helpful to people who are seriously looking into this issue. Now, I think you pointed out about the intent. The law, change in the law, reform is an intent statement. And the law depends on implementation. Right? And that is where I think a lot of people have doubts about this government, particularly so. Even the experience with demonetization, GST rollout, and many of the larger reforms the government has done, or changes government has done. Right? And so the implementation seems to be a key hurdle in this area. Would you have any advice in terms of what governments should be doing to ensure that the intent they have behind passing these reforms would actually be fulfilled? In a sense, what they need to do to execute on the ground.
What the union should do is, in terms of rule making, let's say about private sector entry into the market, obviously there have to be some conditions. You cannot simply say anybody can do anything, etc., or contract farming. I think the federal government, the union government, must sit with agencies like CCS and others and top-notch economists and frame minimal and very practical and very inclusive, easy to enter kind of rules, so that the states will not play foul with that. If you allow the states to make rules as they please, then that will do immense damage to the country. Here, you must hold the bull by its horns and make sure that the bias is in favor of market entry, as long as the protection of the farmers is there, as long as there is no cheating because of asymmetry of power. That's the only thing that the government should bother. Therefore, all other regulations, all other things must be ruthlessly curbed. If that is done, there are two kinds of laws. One kind of laws is merely declaration of intent and there's no mechanism. Other kind of laws like this, economic liberalization, then, or these laws, however incomplete they might appear to be, they are fundamentally different. They are allowing the market players to enter. As long as the entry is actually allowed, the rest of it market does. And I have great faith in a law when the law ensures competition and choice. I have very little faith in a law where the government requires to enforce something to make some things happen. However worthy the government's intentions are, the government has no capacity, even if the will is taken for granted. And there's no culture of doing it honestly and systematically and efficiently and speedily. Now, why are we all wedded to market economy? Not because we are all capitalist pigs, but because we realize market means you and I make informed choices. And if we commit mistakes, then we pay for those mistakes and we learn from that. And millions of people make choices. They make decisions, whether they're buyers or sellers. Ultimately, it's our collective decisions on a day-to-day basis in a dynamic situation that gives us the most optimal output. So you're not trusting any human being. So wherever the reform is pro-choice and pro-market, it will work provided entry barrier is eliminated. The only thing government must make sure in those cases, entry barrier should be removed. Otherwise, if the government says, I want to help farmers, I want a massive procurement mechanism, I want a massive distribution mechanism, I'll do it honestly, I'm a good guy, it will never work. Therefore, I think these laws are different, whether it's a economic liberalization laws or these laws, they don't form part of the other laws. But the only thing is, if you're serious about reform, remove entry barriers. Make sure that regulation does not create unnecessary hurdles. That's the only thing that they have to take. Otherwise, the law in itself created an incentive for the players to enter, and therefore outcomes will be radically different.
By suggesting that central government should make those simple rules for entry.
Absolutely.
And not allow the states to make those themselves.
Absolutely. Otherwise, there is a vested interest. After all, if I am a beneficiary of a corrupt system today, why am I going to allow any kind of a free entry? After all, we must understand there are losers in this. The people of India and the farmers of India will gain. A corrupt civil supplies official in a district, that job typically sells for 1 crore to 2 crore rupees. There's a well-developed market for public office in India. Now, why is he going to make it easy for the trade to enter, for the free market to operate? It's against his personal interest, his common sense.
That's a great idea, right? We should document the price for getting those jobs and see if the price goes up or goes down. after the reforms. That will be one
Absolutely.
good
Absolutely.
question whether the reforms are helping the farmers or helping the bureaucracy.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think a great data to collect for those who are in touch with the ground realities and see whether we can have a more objective understanding of how these prices are for the jobs. We give them, the officers, this kind of power. But what I was going to point out that by suggesting what you suggested, you are walking into the trap of federalism, right? Which is the other common argument made against these reforms, that this is the sort of usurping the power and real genuine rights of the states by the central government. And therefore, people who believe in genuine federal structure and federalism should be opposing this, because this undermines that very value that we hold so dear.
You know, you and I are the greatest champions of decentralization. All my life, if there is one principle for which I have fought and never wavered, is decentralization. The union versus state, state versus local government, local government versus stakeholders, stakeholders versus citizen and family. I have no doubt in my mind. But this is an absurd argument. Let me be a little frank. Article 19(1)(g) is what gives all of us the freedom of trade, business, commerce, anything. We imposed a restriction because of a mindset of the past. Second World War and post-Second World War mindset of control regime. It was simply imported to independent India. As part of that, we had a federal legislation. I've never heard these people ever arguing, why should there be Essential Commodities Act by Parliament? Not one person said it. When they're restricting the freedom of Indians at the federal level, nobody argued against it. Funny. When the federal government is saying, no, sorry, we actually go back to original constitutional framework, namely Article 19(1)(g), whereby you all have freedom to do whatever you like. I have imposed the restriction needlessly and at an enormous cost to society and the people. I am withdrawing that. We are saying federalism. Do we understand what we are saying? Are we saying there is no parliament in India? Are we saying there is no federal government of India? We don't recognize jurisdiction of federal government? Our argument always is you should not restrain our freedom. You give freedom to the citizen, to the community of stakeholders, to the local government, to the state government. And you allow the constitutional liberties to prevail. They are the norm. Exceptions should be few and now temporary. They are saying, sorry, we allowed the exception to become the norm and more or less permanent. We are removing that exception. We are giving the Article 19(1)(g) freedom to everybody. It makes no sense. And constitutional and legal argument. As long as this is giving effect to the fundamental rights under Article 19(1)(g), the Parliament and the state legislature both have power. And of course, the power of Parliament always supersedes the power of the state. The state can make it more liberal. Nobody is going to stop it. If the law of Parliament is restrictive, state can make a more liberal law. B, the issue of price control, etc., is explicitly stated in the concurrent subjects. Therefore, as a lifelong federalist as a fighter for states' rights and local governments' rights, I find this argument completely implausible and disingenuous.
I think that's an important point to remind people that ultimately the role of the government is to design overall structures within which more and more freedoms are given to citizens, right? And we should be judging the quality of the governance or even federal structure on looking more on the personal liberties or economic freedom and personal freedom which are being granted to citizens, and not just in terms of just allocation of power from center to the state. So that's by itself is not going to change the freedom of the citizens, right? You are just creating 28 more centers of power with whom you would have to fight to earn your freedom. So I think that's
just to give one example, this is equivalent of saying, how can Parliament enact Right to Information Act? You are impinging on states' rights. What absurdity is that? Right to information is enlarging the freedom of citizens. It is a Parliament's duty. Nobody argued that states' rights are violated at the time because the civil society, all of us wanted right to information, whatever reasons. We were persuaded. It's actually the identical thing. We are giving freedom back to people. the question of Parliament not acting doesn't arise.
Good. I think as we began discussion about the 91 reforms and the idea that corporates, as you also mentioned that in your own life, that used to be a bad word for quite some time until you began to experience with your own experience what corporates can do and what state does. That's, I think, common fear that you read in most of the commentaries which are opposing these reforms, that this is going to be corporate takeover of agriculture in India. So far, the farmers actually, even though they were obviously not doing so well, but they had some way of supporting themselves. But now these big corporates are going to come and take over whatever is little left for the poor farmers that we have in India.
No. Economically, it is a wrong argument simply because no government is saying you should only sell to a corporate, right? It is saying whatever is the current mode of market, if you think that it works for you, please go ahead, continue that. But you're not limited to that. Your choice now has expanded. Now, we are assuming that the farmers do not know their self-interest. They don't understand whether it's 100 rupees is better or 50 rupees is better for their, let us say, 1 kilogram of the produce. We believe that the nanny state will actually tell them, look, don't sell to him, sell to Parth, no, don't sell to Parth, sell to JP, and only then you'll get the benefit. You're an idiot, you don't know how to count rupees. I don't think that's the basis on which our constitution is written or our commerce operates on a daily basis. So it's fundamentally an uneconomic argument. Secondly, this corporate being a dirty word, no, I'm just looking around because this is an argument that keeps repeating itself. Just a casual glance at the things that around me that I use and use on a day-to-day basis. This pen made by some corporate, this shirt made by some corporate, the mask I wear made by a corporate, the watch I have is made by a corporate, the paper I write on is made by a corporate, this remote control, this television in front of me, this mobile telephone. Corporates have not fleeced me. I have decided to buy what I want. And there are 20 people competing. I decided that this is best for me, for my price range and for the quality that I seek. Nobody is complaining. He will also benefit, obviously. But to say that because a corporate comes, you're losing, what are we saying? The farmer is anyway buying everything from a corporate, from your fertilizer, to your pesticide, to your seeds, to everything is buying from a corporate. Your gunny bag, to everything is buying from a corporate anyway. So that corporate is a dirty word. It makes no sense. Corporate is merely an incorporated company, period. Wonderful human beings, just because they incorporate as a company, they become evil. It doesn't, for the life of me, make sense. So I'm not saying corporates are wonderful, benevolent people. No, I'm saying they're profit seekers. They're investing money. But in a competitive environment, there are 100 players. We can figure out what is best for us. As long as there is no permanent tie-up, there is no slavish relationship, there is no master and serf relationship, there is no compulsion, there is freedom of choice and information. Governments can help in that. If anybody has concerns, governments, political parties, civil society can make everything transparent about pricing, about, for instance, if contract farming is there, how for a certain commodity, contract farming and pricing are working here, elsewhere, and therefore why am I not getting better? Let the farmers have more knowledge. Information asymmetry and empowering the farmers, but not denying access to market. It doesn't make any sense.
And I think in some sense, I think that could be a role for NGOs who want to do farmers, right?
Absolutely. If they love the farmers, let them do that.
Make them aware of the options that are available to them in the language, in the ways in which they can understand and make use of it. So I think a very constructive role the civil society can play in making sure the farmers are empowered with knowledge.
In 2012, this is what we have done. See, the price in Andhra Pradesh of paddy at that time, of bag, a certain variety called BPT, was selling at 750 rupees. Neighboring states, it's 1200. The government banned transport and sale in neighboring states. There was a 450 rupees. There was a 60% difference in pricing. Then I broke those restrictions. I mobilized the farmers, thousands of us carrying those 5 kgs of load. We put shackles around our hands so that we make the people understand how the farmers are shackled. and went on padayatras daring the government. Within 15 days, because the restrictions fell apart, the price was equalized. Farmers got the benefit. So the notion that, my God, if we sell there, what happens? My God, corporate will take over. My God, how can small farmer, 86% of small farmers, how will they go into Karnataka or Maharashtra to sell it? I think, Parth, all of us must focus a great deal more on economic literacy 101, not great economic knowledge, but fundamentals of how market works and how you as a player in the market, as a consumer and producer, have to operate. The simple thing that your vegetable vendor and a hawker understands by intuition and experience, I think most of us don't understand. I think everybody in primary school must have an understanding of the human economic transactions and the principles of economics. I think this is basically a lot of concern, genuine concern. You know, the people who are opposing, they care for farmers. I respect their intentions. I have no doubt about their intentions. But good intentions are not enough. Good judgment based on evidence, based on logic, based on the best practices and experience in our own country and elsewhere, without that, good intentions are not a substitute to sound judgment.
With that sound judgment and good intentions, let's open up for questions from the audience. I know there will be lots of questions coming in. Swati, if you can exercise your moderator's power and bring up some of those questions that you think are going to be relevant to our discussion so far.
Sure, Parth. So there have been quite a few questions related to MSP. So someone has asked whether MSP is problematic because the price of crop remains the same across states, whereas the cost of production differs. Another question is whether you think we should have MSP for products other than just wheat and rice, and we should focus on holistic crops.
First question, Swati, while I understand the intent of the question, there is a fundamental economic law. If a commodity is transportable, if it is not perishable, and if it is tradable, prices equalize. Therefore, there is no way we can really have variations in price, except insofar as variations of quality are measurable. Like already, even now, there is some differentiation of pricing, you know, the coarse rice, the fine rice, superfine rice, etc. Some kind of differentiation is there. I don't know much about the wheat. But beyond that, I don't think the prices can be determined by the production costs, etc. locally. Not only that, it becomes extremely complex and even more corrupt. Already, it's a very corrupt system, the whole procurement system. The second is, those who believe that the state can procure not merely wheat and rice, but a whole lot of commodities and then ensure that the farmers get a decent income. They're well-meaning, but they are forgetting two fundamentals. One, the laws of economics. Two, the realities of economics. The laws of economics being, if the market is allowed to work at a much lower cost, you can actually ensure that the food reaches the table of the poor. The notion that in a country where food is available across the board, the notion that you have to procure, have an elaborate mechanism with leakage and corruption and so many layers, and the cost of carrying cost, as they call it in Food Corporation of India, for each quintal of rice or wheat, and then distribution system, selection of fair price shop dealers, and then they're distributing with the price arbitrage. This is absurd when the food actually is available. If the food for some reason or other is not reaching, it's not accessible physically, then this makes sense even if it's inefficient. But from sub-Himalayan, Himalayan Sivaliks to the island territories of Indian nation, food reaches everywhere. It is affordability that's the question. And therefore, you don't require an elaborate procurement distribution system. You require money in the farmers' pockets. That's what Padhandi discussed. And it's the people's pockets. The second is wheat and rice. Why not extend to others? You know, the cost of wheat and rice procurement and distribution today is 1.5 lakh crores. The total budget of union government, if you actually take out the loans, the debt, because interest repayment and debt servicing is roughly equivalent to the debt. So there's a net zero more or less there. It is only about 17, 18 lakh crores. And in a COVID year, probably it's even less. And that must cater to all the needs of governance of India, the employee salaries, defense of India, which alone costs about 3.5, 4 lakh crores now with pensions, etc. Then your basic infrastructure, the transfer to states, and many, many other things. You know the total produce cost of India in agriculture? 35 lakh crores annually. At 16, 17% of GDP, 35 lakh crores. How on earth are we going to, even assuming that government has the capacity, and we have already seen government is utterly incompetent and thoroughly corrupt. Even assuming that by some miracle you can overcome those problems, there is no way you can have the agricultural commodities trade to be completely taken up by the government. Indira Gandhi tried that in terms of wholesale trade in food grains. In 73, 74, they actually promulgated an ordinance. Within months, Mrs. Gandhi gave up and withdrew it because it was just not operating. Nowhere in the world have they done it successfully. They cannot. And we cannot afford it. It will be utterly dysfunctional, chaotic, and destructive of this country.
Go ahead, Swati.
Other than that, there is also a question about the public distribution system and how the PDS is heavily dependent on government procurement. So do you think these laws are going to hamper the PDS mechanism in any way?
I already answered that question in passing. Now, if you, I genuinely believe we can't do it overnight, but over a period of 5-10 years, we must progressively stop this procurement, put the money into people's pockets directly, and dismantle this corrupt and leakage prone and utterly inefficient distribution system, and make sure that the people have the capacity to purchase and educate them about nutrition. And in schools, etc., what we're doing, strengthen the program so that the poor children get better nutrition, wholesome proteins, not merely calories and other things if you can. But the current model is both from health point of view, nutrition point of view is hopelessly inadequate and dysfunctional. Economic point of view, utterly corrupt and leakage prone. So this is just not the right way.
Sure. There's another question about whether the government should also ease restrictions on sale and transfer of agriculture land, and if yes, what would be its benefits?
It's a great question. It's a courageous question. Let's not go into very big things. But Karnataka recently, I don't know how many of you have followed, they have doubled the agricultural land ceiling limit by one stroke of the pen. Very wise move. You cannot completely dismantle everything because, that's also not a wise thing. But unless you give sufficient scale, people of quality are not going to invest there. Now, agriculture is not a sector people enter in order to make money, unless you have some passion and madness, because of India is largely still agricultural in terms of at least social values and norms. Even if you are urban, your ancestors, your parents, grandparents are from a village. So there is that attachment with land. And for that reason, some people are willing to enter. But with the kind of economies of scale that you have, it's impossible. Anybody with ambition and ability have to forsake agriculture. That's the reason why there's almost nobody of any quality and some education and ability who is staying back in villages. It's inevitable. If you have ambition and some ability, you have to go away from villages. If you want some investment to flow back and some entrepreneurs to actually go back to agriculture and to innovate, then you require scale. Therefore, significant enhancement in the ceiling limit is the first step. The second thing is we have, in many respects, damaged the land market to the detriment of the farmer, pretending to be the farmer's friends. For instance, the land assigned, as we call it, in the legal term, assignment of land to the poor, government land given to the poor. What have we done? Prohibition of alienation of assigned lands. The law prohibits them from selling the land. That means they can never market it. They have the land. It's heritable. It's absurd. We all know about Hernando de Soto's work. If you're sitting on that, but you don't have a complete title, it's not fungible, it's not saleable, then you don't have an asset. It's only there. And you can never invest anyway, because in most cases, they don't have the capacity. And with the appreciation of market values, they're not able to monetize that. As a nation, we are losing the value of their asset. As a family, they are losing the commercial value of the asset. Let them sell. Supposing the society, the community, the commons need that for an infrastructure or some other purpose, let's give compensation, take back the land. I have no quarrel with that. But otherwise, give them full rights. Similarly, in the name of protecting the tribals, there was some discussion of tribals. Parth mentioned that. In the name of protecting the tribals, we said land transfer regulation. The land there cannot be sold to anybody but a tribal. And a tribal is not willing to buy or is not capable of buying. Therefore, you guaranteed that the land has no market. And capital will not flow into agriculture. Absurd. If you allow the tribals, you make sure that the tribals get the best value. If they want to continue in agriculture, they can continue. If they want to move to something better, let them get the value for that land. So these misplaced but well-meaning restrictions on the land market have done immense damage to the farmers, to the poor, to the tribals, and the people who are granted land. These restrictions should go. The third thing is, to the extent possible, at least in the southern parts of the country, I don't know much about you. I think Punjab, Haryana, already the problem was addressed to Pratap Singh Karan, a very far-sighted chief minister, and Sir Chauturam, a very far-sighted agriculture minister. They looked at consolidation of land as one of the key elements of land reforms. Whereas in the south, it's only about partitioning of land and ceilings. They never bother about consolidation. Typically, a farmer in the same village has 3 parcels of small pieces of land. Now, make it easy for consolidation among the farmers. Let's repeat what 50, 60 years ago, Punjab, Haryana have done. If you do at least these things, let's not look at removing all land ceilings. No, then you open up the Pandora's box and needlessly there is a big ideological fight. It's not necessary. Just liberalize land ceilings to reasonable extent. What Karnataka has done already. I applaud Karnataka government. Doesn't matter which party, which color, which whatever it is. It's the right direction. Remove the land market restrictions in the form of assigned lands being sold and in the form of land transfer regulations for the scheduled areas. And allow consolidation of land within the village without any serious legal or economic cost to the farmers. The rest of it, I think farmers will take care.
I think that is also the way to farmers can exit agriculture. If
Absolutely.
I'm a small holding farmer, my only asset is land. If I want to do something myself or my children, right, that's an asset I can use to start something else.
Absolutely.
I'm able to convert that asset into capital that I can use for other business. Right? And I think that's a huge constraint we have put on, in the sense, just holding them hostage, right, in some ways.
Absolutely.
To farm. We are not allowing them to leave farms. And a lot of surveys suggest almost 70-75% of the farmers do not want to continue in farming.
Absolutely. There is not a farmer, except a few, who want to stay there if other options are available. In fact, you know what's the commonest complaint farmers make? Very evocative one. Even if you're reasonably educated, you have some means and some decent parcel of land, you're not getting married because you're a farmer. Unless you're willing to go to a town. Seriously, this is actually the commonest complaint. My son is not getting matches. Now, in our country, still arranged marriages, and that's a common practice for 80-90% people. Getting married is becoming difficult if you're still in farming. So if they want to leave farming, if they want to monetize the asset or enlarge the asset and therefore have economies of scale and greater sense of respect and economic opportunity, I don't understand why you're going to impose the shackles.
Swati, I'm just looking at the clock. We have passed our 1 hour mark. So I'll leave it to your judgment how long you want to continue.
So one of the questions is actually about what comes next after the farm laws and what more reforms are necessary to re-energize the agriculture sector. So maybe that would be a great question to also conclude the session with.
It's an absolutely great question. In fact, I was waiting for this. One of the problems of this whole debate today is the government's exaggerated claims that it is a revolution. It is a panacea. It is not. It is just one significant, important, but small step. Long overdue. All you did is a negative thing of removing the shackles. That's not enough. A lot more needs to happen. One is storage capacity. 450 million tons of perishable commodities are produced in farming. Our storage capacity is only 38 million tons. Most of it is only for potato. Cold storage particularly. And storage capacity with credit system, because unless the farmer has the staying power when the price is running low, by the ability to store, but he can only store A, when the physical infrastructure is there, and B, when the financial infrastructure is there. Just because the physical storage facility is there, if I don't have money to sustain my family and to raise the next crop, I cannot afford to stay. Therefore, pledge loans, because after all, the stock is there as security. Banks lose nothing. Today, only 1 to 2% of the stock is getting pledge loans. The second is compressing the market chain. There are about 6 intermediaries typically in the agricultural sector between the producer and the consumer. Net result is the end price that the produce gets, let's say if it's 100 rupees, on an average, the farmer is only getting 20 to 25 rupees, one of the lowest in the world. Wherever market chain is compressed, wherever a retail chain is taking care of the whole logistical chain, integrated chain of grading, packaging, transport, storage, processing, retailing, all these, they're working on volumes with low margins, and the farmer gets about 60 to 65% of the end price. As long as there are no monopolies in that, it's all win-win. And they'll open up the global markets because there's $100 billion potential for additional exports in agriculture. We desperately need that as a farm sector and as a country. India has 12% of the world's agricultural land, but our share in the global agricultural trade is 1.6%. Many commodities, papaya, lime, orange, other things, we are #1 producers in the world. Our share is in papaya about 2%, in lime 0.5%, and in orange is 0.3%, and so on and so forth. It's a disgrace. Small people cannot open those markets, phytosanitary measures and so on and so forth. Only economies of scale, processing, grading, quality of production, and ability to address the phytosanitary roadblocks and the barriers across the world. And therefore, we have to really allow the retail chains. Already the policy is in place, but even the current government is stopping. Because their own front organizations have some Luddite concerns, what will happen, my God, colonization, East India Company, all kinds of things. So we have to break that open. That's what I was telling the ruling party people today. I had a meeting with them. I was telling them, now that you've done it, go to the next step. Don't pretend that this is a revolution. And obviously processing, real boost to that by a variety of means, opening up export markets, and to the extent possible, to the extent that the Indian purse permits, shut down all the unnecessary programs and subsidies, instead make it a meaningful direct subsidy to farmers in the form of cash on some agreed basis. So there is support from other sectors, but not dysfunctional or not economically distortionary. So if this much at least is attempted, some of them are going to be difficult to dismantle the existing subsidies and convert this. It will take time, but at least you have a roadmap. Many committees, many economists over the years have recommended that. Government must start the process, not when, but perhaps this is the right time. Because then if they do the full measure, they'll actually see the dramatic results in agriculture politically also is beneficial. Doing half measures, it will seem to be inadequate to improve the lot of the farmers. Government anyway gets the flack, and therefore it's the worst of both the worlds. Therefore, we must be persuasively able to explain to the people in politics and make them take the next steps.
I really support that last point that you made, JP, that by doing half-hearted reforms, right, you may end up doing actually far more damage to the people.
Absolutely.
Than what you intend, right?
Absolutely.
You can see, for example, I just cited from the CCS research about Maharashtra private mandis.
Correct.
So on paper, you can say is now open to private sector, with the licensing requirements of 10 acre of land, 2 crore of investment is not going to bring in anybody to in the sector, right? And
Absolutely.
So on one hand, people say, oh, you open the sector, but nothing really happened for the farmers. It's just a shell game that you are playing. Right? I think it's important for government to understand. I hope that you and many others who are working in the area and talking to the government are able to explain to them that if they really want electoral benefit to come out of these reforms, they
Absolutely.
need to see it through to the logical conclusion. Otherwise, it's going to backfire because half-hearted reforms are not going to deliver value for farmers. They will be angry at you because you did not deliver what you had promised them to deliver.
Correct. And there is a non-agricultural issue here. The village distress is real. We all understand that. But village distress is not entirely only because of agriculture. It's about education, healthcare. The cost is going up. The quality of education, healthcare is substandard for them. Productivity is low, and their kids don't have a chance in the market economy tomorrow. Therefore, improving education, therefore the recent education policy, which is actually, I think, an extremely sound instrument after a long time, but actually making it work. That's where the government has to actually work, because it's not enough to have the policy. And healthcare, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface. And without extraordinary additional cost, health does require some investment, but I believe with 0.5% of GDP additional investment, dramatic improvement is possible if you do it the right way. So we must actually alleviate the rural distress, but by very innovative means at a relatively low cost. I hope somebody is doing the strategic thinking, and we have to sit with them and encourage them. And there is an electoral reward. I entirely agree with Parth. Unless the politicians see the benefit electorally, they will not do it. And I believe it makes economic logic, the evidence and the logic support it. Now that they've taken one step, we must push them in that direction. I believe in all parties, many people recognize it. Forget the sloganeering for political purposes. But privately, almost all political parties, leading people really care for agriculture and rural economy. I believe their heart is in the right place. And if we sit with them, we can actually, despite the visible discord, actually we can build an impressive consensus. I really don't see any serious resistance to this. Punjab, Haryana, because the mandis are very powerful there, they're politically connected. They're able to mount this, and there is a fear of losing MSP. Otherwise, the rest of the country, nobody cares. No, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, despite what the political parties are saying, nobody is raising a single voice. BJP has no hold at all here. It's nothing to do with BJP. So farmers understand intuitively. I don't think there's much of an issue. Even in political parties, I believe there's an impressive consensus privately, but public dissent.
Also, good time to point out that Setkari Sangathan, which
Absolutely.
is the farmers group started by late Sharad Joshi, has
Absolutely.
gone on march to support these reforms. And this is something I've been asking for a long time, as we know.
Absolutely. Sharad Joshi, he opened the eyes of many people in the country. He was an extraordinary pioneer who, instead of decayed route and other things, he actually tried to make people understand the value of market economy for the farmers, even as they deserve some support, and recognized it.
I would suggest, Swati, you can put a link to that writings of Mr. Joshi, also be very helpful for people to know the history, right? It's not just what happened today or in the last 2 weeks, but how the argument for these reforms have been built up over a long period of time. And not just by people who are sitting in the offices like we are currently, but people who have worked on the ground, who themselves have been farmers, right? They also understood what is required to improve the lives of the community.
In fact, in 2012, when I carried this talk to Maharashtra, to Sharad Joshi and his team, which bought from me.
Oh. Yes.
Parth, I would like to invite you to give some concluding remarks, and then we can close out the session.
Oh, I think we had a great conversation, and thank you, JP, for engaging in this dialogue. I think we hope to do it more often. I think there are a lot of ideas that come. I think we at least try as honestly as possible to deal with the counter arguments which have been put forward. I think I did try to work hard to make sure that I summarize at least all of them that I come across. Right? And I think we did a sort of fair, decent job of taking them into account. And I think not just that we have promoted these ideas before, but I think it's really a time that government puts its heart behind what is really good for the people. Right? At the end of the day, it's not about corporates, it's not about think tanks, it's not about activists, it's really about the people whose lives are at stake. Right? And I think if that is to do value, do justice to them, then I think there is no argument in democracy not to have the courage to do it, to the right thing.
Thank you, Parth. Now, let me just say a couple of things very quickly. The first is the power of the contest, as you're saying. Now, I think there is time and momentum, at least for the agricultural sector reforms. Let us take it to logical conclusion. We must push it now, because no matter how much you work in normal times, it will never have the same impact as today. Second, let us not dismiss or insult the concerns of the people who are opposing. Most of them are well-meaning. They have genuine concerns. Genuine doesn't mean that they are logical. Just because something is not necessarily very logical doesn't make it any less sincere. I think we must respect that and acknowledge that, and then address it patiently and repeatedly, because we have created a certain psychology and a certain language of discourse for 70 years of third-rate socialist mindset. It's not going to go easily. Therefore, we must have patience and respect for the people who are opposing these reforms. Actually, most of them are well-meaning. I'm genuinely of that view. Third is, we must tell the government, the last point that we all discussed, that there is a political benefit if they actually go to the logical extent instead of doing it half-heartedly. And there are votes in that. And all of us will do our best to make the farmers' organizations raise their voice so that the people understand the value of the vote. But if anybody with a political sense looks around, they actually can see that a lot of farmers are not at all resisting it. Because farmers are not well organized and they divided by caste, they may not show the solidarity, but there's hardly any resistance. Just because Punjab and Haryana are closer to Delhi, you must not presume that is India. No, without any disrespect intended for any part of India, there's a whole lot of India. And even Punjab, Haryana, it's because of the special circumstances. They had a fantastic government in the early days of independence of Sukhdev Singh Kauran and Chautu Ram. And therefore the mandis were effective, and the mandi leaders became politically and socially very significant people. And they feel that their monopoly is lost, their power is lost. And there is an unnecessary link created between MSP and these reforms. Without these two, there is no issue in Punjab and Haryana. Therefore, I am absolutely convinced there is no real issue politically. It's just a lot of noise levels. And the government's bungling or the unpopularity for other reasons may unnecessarily be complicating this. But we must delink it from the normal politics and look at it as an economic issue related to the farmers, and try and persuade the government that if you do it right and fully, you actually get the political benefit.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope we can continue the conversation on the spontaneous order blog and many of the work that CCS has been doing, and many others are doing actually in the larger country.
Yeah, so with that, we can come to a close. Thank you, Dr. Parth and Dr. JP Narayan, for unpacking this extremely complex issue. Thank you also to all our viewers for joining us today. And if you want to read more about some of the issues that we've discussed here, please refer to our newly released Agriculture Primer. The link has already been shared with you in the comment section. So thank you so much.